Christmas is a good time to remember the enslaved people that built this country. It was a time of uncertainty for them in some ways, but in some ways it was festive and happy. I say happy, it was as happy as it could be under the circumstances. Happy in that this would be one of the times that they would get a pass to go visit their relatives on other plantations. Some of them had a wife or a husband living on a different plantation that they lived, had children, their parents. So this would have been a time that they would have gotten a pass to go visit their relatives. So that would have been a happy time for them. Christmas then was one way of them marking time. They knew that a year had passed since the last time they were able to go visit a relative or to have a day off from work, because they had no other way of marking time except when something happened or when something changed. So I want to talk a little bit about what Christmas must have been like for them. It would begin with the enslaved men going into the forest and picking out the best tree, cutting it down and bringing it to the main house. And the enslaved women, the house servants, would decorate the tree and begin big-time cooking and cleaning and preparing for guests. This was an important season for the enslavers, because this was the time of the year that they got to show off their wealth that the enslaved people had provided for them. So they'd have big balls and parties, and this was also a preferred time to get married. And let us not forget that on top of doing everything else, the slaves had to provide the music for these events. So many of the enslaved people took their work very seriously. It wasn't just about working for someone else. It was also about representing themselves. And as a side note, the skills that many of the enslaved people cultivated during slavery were the basis for them making a living or building a business once slavery was over. The field slaves had to make sure that all the crops were in, the livestock were tended to and fed, repairs were made around the plantation, and the grounds were immaculate before they could even begin to think about Christmas. On some plantations, on some of the less strenuous plantations, the male slaves would bring in something called a Yule log. That would be a log that they would put on the fireplace. And as long as that log was burning, they would have time off from work. So naturally, they looked for the biggest log in the forest, because in some cases, that log would burn till New Year's. So they would have time off from Christmas Day to New Year's. So that was on some of the plantations where they weren't quite as harsh. So Massa and Mistress and their children were all snuggled, warm, and cozy in their beautiful plantation house, enjoying Christmas, compliments of our ancestors, the slaves. Christmas Day was a special time for the enslaved people, and in pictures you can often see them all gathered around, a big crowd of them, in the front yard of the main house and waiting for Massa to come out and grace them with his presence. Also, not only his presence, but presents, because this would be the time that they would get their 2 rations of clothes. They only had 2 sets of clothing, and they had to last the whole year. So it's no wonder that sometimes you see pictures of enslaved people walking around with clothes that look like they're too little or by several sizes sometimes. This was also the time that they got a ration of food. Sometimes they did get a little extra food at Christmas time. Sometimes the master would let them have a little alcohol to drink. If they had a good growing season, they might receive something else, a slice of cake or some extra meat or something like that. One big thing that the master would do is give them a cane of peppermint candy, and that carried on into my lifetime when black people who worked for white people the white people would come to see them on Christmas Day and give them a stick of peppermint candy. So something special about peppermint candy. But Christmas Day was a a special time for them because they were just a little bit more relaxed, and especially if they were on a plantation where the people weren't sadistic, where they had some level of decency, of human decency. Christmas was a special time for them. And again, it was a time when they could go visiting their relatives on other plantations. They had to have that pass, but they could go. Down in the slave quarters at Christmas, I think we would find the enslaved people doing what was normal for them, doing what was normal for anybody. Talking, working, cooking, children playing, men carrying things, building things, repairing things, doing what's normal for people to do. The only problem was these people were in bondage and they did not have free movement of thought or body. But to the extent that they were able to make the best of a bad situation, they made the best of a bad situation. And Christmas time was one of the times when they were able to create the culture that came out of their existence, where they danced and sang and told funny stories and enjoyed life to the very best of their ability. They barbecued. This whole thing about black men barbecuing, that started in that system. Black women cooking, and it becomes Southern cooking for some people, but we know it to be soul food. Yes, Southern cooking came out of the slave system because many of the foods that make up Southern cooking came from Africa. They brought that food on those slave ships because the enslaved people would not eat the food that the Europeans were eating. So they had to bring their own food, and then they experimented. Some of the spices that may have been available to them in Africa may not have been available here, so they began to use the spices here, making the food better with the spices that they had access to. So yes, Southern cooking comes out of soul food cooking, which comes out of the enslaved system. So Christmas was culture creating time. They had a few days off to rest. The crops were in, and it was too soon to start planting for the next season. So they had a chance to tend their gardens, hunt. I know the men hunted rabbit and deer. That comes down through the culture. And the women cooking, doing special dishes, creating the foundation for soul food. I can imagine that they had dance contests to see who was the best buck dancer or whatever, the jitterbug or whatever they were doing, and singing contests. Surely black women were out there belting out songs to see who could sing the best. And I'm sure somebody was trying to tell jokes. So this was a happy time for them, a moment of normalcy in a very abnormal system. There would have been some kind of worship during Christmas. If the slave master was there, they would have kept it low and quiet. But when he left, they would have done their own thing. They would have praised in their own way. Because they were spiritual people, if not religious. Experience had taught them when they could be themselves and when they could not be. Christmas could also be an especially sad time on those plantations because if the slave master had not managed his money right, if the crops hadn't done well, he might well have to sell off some of those slaves. And that meant breaking up families and friendships. And it was also a time when new slaves would be coming in, and they might either be fresh off the boat from Africa, or they might be being sold off or bought onto one plantation from another. Either way, it could be a very sad time during Christmas, because they wanted to start the new planting season off with the people that they were going to have to do the crop for the next season. So Christmas could be sad in that way. And also, this was a time when people might run away. They'd already gotten wind that they were going to be sold, and they decided, well, this is going to be my chance, and I'm getting up out of here. So while everybody else was distracted, partying and dancing and eating and all of that, the ones who had planned to go decided it's going to be my time to go. I found this reward for Lucy Payne, who had run away in June, and they hadn't got up with her by February of 1851, and they described her as 50 years old, well set and fleshy, full breast, front teeth decayed, grayish hair, the nail on one of her 4 fingers injured, which means they've done something to her, a small red mark on one of her cheeks, 5 feet 2 inches, a handkerchief generally on her head, and they're going to pay $10 to get her back, or if they can get her locked up in jail. Now here's a 50-year-old woman. She's been enslaved, no doubt, all of her life. She had the courage to run away, and they couldn't get up with her, so now they're looking for her. And she has a husband in Washington City. So that means that she got away to Washington, so where she's in freedom. And she's not going back. Hopefully, they never caught up with Lucy. And I'm thinking, she's 50 years old. I mean, let's just let the sister have a break. But they wouldn't do that. Everybody had to be recovered, if at all possible. So it was a time when many of them who had the courage to do so made their run. Not surprisingly, Christmas time was a time when the revolutionaries, the ones who were planning uprisings, made their move. So the patrollers, as the enslaved people called the police, were on high alert depending on what part of the country they lived in. They were always afraid of slave uprisings because they were always happening. History doesn't always record all of them. America likes to give the impression that the slaves were really happy and they loved their slave master and the slave master's family, and they would never run away. They would never do anything to hurt the slave master because they were happy. But that's just not the truth. But there were a lot of them fought back. It's just that they were outnumbered and outgunned. But they did fight back, and Christmas was one of the times that they struck. And they had to watch them because the whole idea was to keep those people on those plantations, because we have to remember this was an economic system. These people were generating massive amounts of money for these European people. So they wanted to keep every one of them on the plantation. And lastly, every year carries its number, as we say. And so there would be somebody was going to die. Some of those slaves, they didn't live very long. Some of them did, but most of them did not live very long. I think the lifespan might have been like in the 40s or 50s for the average. So this was a time also for saying goodbye in that way too. So Christmas on a plantation was the adaptation to a system that was very abnormal, that was cruel in its very nature. But it was also a time when people made the best of a bad situation, and they waited till their change came. And eventually the change came. For me, the tragedy of slavery and the shame of America is that those people put in 246 years of real slavery, government-sanctioned slavery, and then another 100 years of Jim Crow slavery, and America does not even want to acknowledge what they did and doesn't want to compensate them in any way. This country became what it has become because of the slave system. There is no way that this country, being as young as it is, it only became a country in 1776 or 1785 or something like that. That's a very young country. It is the most powerful country in the world, according to them. There is no way they could have done that without the slave system. And yet, we get no recognition and no compensation. And to me, that is disgraceful.